Hey everyone, welcome back to Tech Corner. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to you about the difference between mixing and mastering. So as usual, we're back in Metropolis Studios. I'm in one of the production rooms in a minute, the normal room that I'm in for these videos. But also within this building, there is a range of the best mastering studios in the whole of the world, let alone the UK. Now, because these studios are pretty much the best in the world, they're extremely busy, so I didn't have the opportunity to get into one of those today to show you around. However, the theory that I'm going to go through today kind of stays the same. So the difference between mixing and mastering. This is a question that I get asked a lot. What are the necessary processes for mixing compared to the necessary processes for mastering? First of all, we need to understand the differences between them on a very basic fundamental level. Now, the main difference between them is mixing, you are dealing with a multitude of different elements and trying to balance them. So mixing is about creating a balance between all of the elements within your track. And when I talk about balance, I mean it in terms of two separate things. First of all, and most importantly, the volume balance between each of the elements within your track. It's a really good idea to understand the importance of loudness within mixing. Whatever style of music that it is you're making, there will be a most important element, whether that's the vocals, whether that's the drums, whatever it is, you will know what is the most important element within your track. Now, in mixing and understanding a volume balance, that should be the loudest thing, and everything else should fall into place beneath that. So for instance, for a contemporary pop track, the most important three elements would be the vocals, the drums, and the main melody. After those three things would be the backup synthesizers or the backup instruments, the backing vocals, and so on. And then after that, the least important would be things like effects and sort of background bed, pad sort of atmospheric sounds. Now, within those three areas of most important, second important, and not very important, you need to decide what is most important within them. So the vocals, the drums, and the lead melody elements, what is going to be most important out of those? You decide, and you decide what one should be loudest. Now, there is sort of an unwritten rule, which was adopted by many mix engineers for years and years, and that is the idea that your mix should never go above -6 decibels full scale, meaning the scale of what your meter in Logic would show you. It should never really go above -6 decibels. Now, in order to adhere to that, you need to make sure that all of the elements within your track will be below that, because once they're added together and you make the sum of all of those, the volume will be louder. So, the loudest element around about -8 decibels, the second loudest elements around about -12, and then after that, the lesser important things around -16 and below. This is a really good place to start when dealing with balance in terms of volume. But then you get onto balance in terms of stereo width. Now, in all contemporary music nowadays, we listen to things in stereo. It's not a gimmick anymore. It's not something like in the 60s and sort of the Beatles times where stereo just came about and people were putting drums in the left and everything else in the right because it was a new thing. Nowadays, we're used to stereo audio. Now, because of that, we need to understand how wide certain elements within a track should be. This works hand in hand with volume balance. So, the most important parts of the track are normally quite central within the stereo field. Lead vocals, kick drums, snare drums, bass lines generally sit around the mono area, straight down the middle of your stereo field. What you will find now is the more higher frequency information, things like hi-hats, backing vocals, guitars, synths, things that have less bassier frequencies, sound better panned outwards and fanned left to right. Now remember, you have a full pan from all the way left to all the way right, regardless of what DAW or mixing desk, analog or digital, you'll be using. So you get to decide where each of those elements is placed in a stereo field. Now within mixing, simply making a good volume balance and panning balance can make a mix sound incredible with just that. You don't need to throw loads of plugins and loads of processing at a mix in order to get it to sound good. If the recordings are good and the individual elements sound good or were programmed well or recorded well, a good balanced mix in terms of volume and panning is key. So to sum up what mixing is, it's the balance of elements within your track. The production stage, you're making all the elements. In the mixing stage, you're making those elements work as a whole, understanding their balance in terms of volume and panning, but also making sure that you leave yourself headroom in order to go to the mastering stage. So that brings us to mastering. What is mastering? Mastering is basically the finalization of any project. It's the last step in any project's lifespan. It is where you decide how loud your track is going to be. Now, mastering historically was done as a necessity because you needed to have a master copy of something, like when you go to a hotel and you see the people opening doors to clean the rooms, they have a master key that opens everything. In the music world, you need a master copy. That master copy gets sent off to a pressing plant or a distribution place where they make copies of that either on CD or vinyl or whatever, or tape if they still do that. And then that will then get distributed and sold. But it all works off a master. This could be a vinyl called a lacquer. This could be a DAT tape if you're in the early 90s. This could be a cassette tape. This could be a reel-to-reel tape. But there would have been a master made of the original track in order to distribute more of them. Nowadays, that's not as common, really due to the fact that we consume music digitally. We stream music a lot more. We still download music, but it's more in terms of WAV files instead of hard copies that you buy on CD or vinyl. It still gets done, but it's nowhere near as popular as streaming and downloading. Now, because of this, there are certain rules that you have to adhere to in terms of loudness. Certain platforms like Spotify, Tidal, Apple Music, they all have loudness recommendations. Now, these are recommendations, they're not requirements. So, for instance, Spotify will play your music back at -14 LUFS, which stands for loudness units full scale. This is an average loudness from loudest point to quietest point of the track. Spotify will play your music back at -14 LUFS. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to master your tracks to -14 LUFS. In a way, it's better if you do it a little bit louder, closer to -10, -9. That's more of a competitive, loud sound. All Spotify will do is turn that track's gain down. It won't alter your mastering chain or add further processing. It will physically just turn it down. So it will sound exactly like everything else that's out there, but it will have the loudness and the thickness from a loudly mastered track. So we've gone off on a bit of a tangent there in terms of recommendations for streaming and so on. But what actually is mastering? I mentioned before, it is the finalization of any project, but mastering, you are dealing with a stereo file. In mixing, you're dealing with all the individual elements and trying to get them to work together as one whole thing. In mastering, you take that one whole thing as a stereo file and you master it. You make it sound as good as it can possibly be. In mastering, you don't want to make the track sound different. You want to make the mix sound as good as it possibly can be and as loud as it can be, competitive to other tracks in that genre. For instance, I would never master a dubstep track the same way and to the same loudness as I would an orchestral track, really due to the fact that they're very contrasting genres and the requirements for a dubstep track are vastly different to the ones for an orchestral track. So what are the main processes needed for mastering? Firstly, equalization. In order to get that mix to sound as good as it possibly can be, you will need some form of equalization, some form of manipulation to frequency content. Now, in mastering, this is done minimally, very small amounts here and there. You may use multiple EQs for different needs. You may have an EQ that you like in the low end that sounds good on bass, and you may have one that sounds good in the high end. It's completely okay to use one EQ for one certain area and another for another area. But you decide how these are going to work based on what the mix sounds like. For instance, if your mix is quite bright and it's not as warm as you'd like it to be, you could use an EQ to warm it up by lifting the mid-range, making the bass a little bit warmer, or simply ducking some of the higher range to make it sound less bright. That's a really good tip if you want something to sound old. Older things sound old because of the technology used at the time, and the mastering process and the mixing process, and the equipment that was used to do it. Valve equipment, all analog equipment, driven into tape, you lose some of the top end. That's why it sounds warm. If you want to replicate that in a master, you can kind of do the same thing with an EQ. Boost some of the lows and the mid-range and duck some of the high range. Now, the other essential process for mastering is limiting. In order to get loudness out of your mix in a competitive way to stand up next to other tracks in that style, you need to use a limiter. Now, most commonly, the limiters used are plug-in limiters, because a digital limiter you can get so much more loudness out of than an analog limiter. Now, there are many different plug-in limiters available. The FabFilter Pro L2 is a staple in all high-end and bedroom style mastering. You've got the classic Waves L2 maximizer, which is also a limiter which has been used for many years on countless amount of tracks. But the reason for using this limiter is to drive the volume into a ceiling amount. Now, your ceiling amount is the loudest your mix will ever be in terms of its peak volume. So, In order to get something that you know is going to be loud enough but never clip, it's a good idea to set your limiter's ceiling to around about minus 0.5. This means that it's only half a decibel quieter than clipping, which you don't really perceive, but it's just enough to make sure it will never actually clip. Some mastering engineers go as low as minus 1 decibel on their limited peak. But the point of the limiter is to decide that peak volume and then push the rest of the track towards it, towards that ceiling. This gives you overall thickness and loudness. And this is where you can drive up your LUFS or average loudness from. One last tip, make sure your limiter is the last processor in the chain that you're going to use for mastering. Do not put the limiter first and then put other effects like equalization, saturation, compression afterwards, because then it's no longer limited. You need to make sure the limiter is the last thing in the chain. The only thing that should ever come after a limiter is a metering plugin, something that will show you the numbers that you need to get, the loudness that you need to get, the frequency content that you're looking for, the stereo width that you're looking for. Again, there's loads of metering plugins that can be used. A lot of stock metering plugins like Logic's Multimeter is excellent for this. But again, there may be some other third-party ones like Isotope's Insight or the T-Rax metering plugin, or even some free ones like Span that you can use in order to get detailed and accurate output readings. So, that was a bit geeky, but I think it's really important to understand the difference between the two completely separate processes in your music productions. You start with the idea, you then move on to the production and recording of that idea. Once you've done that, you move on to the mixing of that idea, where you get all of those elements that you've produced and you make them work as a family, you make them work together, you understand the balance of the most important things, you can put things left and right to decide a nice stereo image and move things out the way of each other so they're more noticeable in the track. Once that's done, you take that as a stereo mix and you master it. You apply equalization to make it as sweet as possible, as open as possible, and then you apply a limiter to get your desired loudness for whatever platform you want to distribute it to, whether that's strictly for streaming only, whether that's strictly for hard copy sale, or whether that's for both. So that's it for this week. Hopefully that wasn't too geeky. If you're interested in more about mastering and mixing and just general production in any way, contact ACM at the website www.acm.co.uk. Sign up for an open day. I'll probably be there. I'll chat to you about what we do here. Come and walk around the studios and we'll see if we can get you on board with the ACM. Take care and I'll see you next time.